Well, if you can get a good teacher who's passionate about what they're teaching, then that is what really inspires students to love that subject matter. And that's certainly a truth. But I would say most teachers and homeschool parents who abide by that are often breaking one or more of these 4 C's that kill curiosity.
And when you see that love of learning stamped on a program or on a class somewhere, ask them, how do you foster the love of learning, and what does the love of learning mean in your program? So that you can really make an educated decision now that you know what love of learning is.
What if I told you that a story could teach your child more history, science, math, and literature than a year of textbooks? Welcome to the Story Schooling Podcast. I'm Angel Selden, author of Curiouser.
And I'm Sandy Fouts, co-founder of Wonder Well Learning.
Love of learning. Doesn't it give you all the good feels? Every education program says it. Every parent wants it. But very few actually know how to foster it. And that's what we're going to dive into today.
So first, let's define what is love of learning.
I want to clarify that when we talk about love of learning here on the Story Schooling Podcast, we are not talking about having knowledge. Like, it's not being smart and having the knowledge that you are in love with, that brings you joy. It is the process of learning that brings you joy.
I recently read a story about somebody who spent their summer building a treehouse, and they had this beautiful tree in their yard, and they did all of the planning, and they had to measure all of the wood and figure out how to fit this treehouse and where they would attach the different pieces of wood to make the planks, and how they would create a way to get up into the treehouse, and how they would create a way that nobody else could get up in the treehouse, once they were up there, and what kind of shelter was going to cover the top. And they spent all of this time building this treehouse. And then once it was built, they spent a couple of days in it, and then it was kind of abandoned and forgotten, because the true joy they had was not actually the treehouse itself. What brought them the excitement that they did all summer was the building of the treehouse. And that's what we're looking for when we talk about the love of learning. We're talking about how that enjoyment that they felt in the process, and not necessarily the end result.
Exactly. It is part of our humanness to want to create, to want to engage in the process of creation and discovery. So, Sandy, why do we want our children to love learning? Come to think of it, maybe this isn't a core value for everyone. I have heard parents say, and maybe this is more old school, but I've heard parents say, look, learning is just something hard you have to get through. You have to learn to do hard, boring things to get where you need to in life. Maybe it is important that we talk about why we want our children to love learning. Do you have any thoughts on that, Sandy?
I think about my oldest. She, when you're going through the journey and you're guiding your child's education, sometimes you wonder, am I really screwing this up? Have I got this down? Have I figured this out? And she's 24 now. She's in grad school, and she finally came back to me recently, and she said, Mom, I see what you did now. Like, I get it. And she's watching her other classmates who are doing the work, but they're not loving the work that they're doing. And she's reading through the textbook, and somebody said to her, why don't you just read the Cliff Notes? Like, that would be so much easier. Just read the Cliff Notes. You can get the work done. And she's like, but I would miss these cool pieces, and I wouldn't have all the information, and I wouldn't be able to deduce all of these cool things and be able to apply it in the way that she was so excited to be able to apply it. And I don't think it's something that we're teaching. It's actually something we're trying not to kill. It's something we're not trying not to change that natural instinct in our children to love learning.
Maria Montessori said that the best indicator of the quality of a child's education is the happiness of the child. And so when they are loving learning, when they're enjoying learning, then that's actually the best indication we have of the quality of their learning. So when they're loving learning, they are gaining a better understanding of what they're learning. It sparks in them a desire to learn more and more. And like you were pointing out, that's one of the ingredients of a happy life, because discovery is one of the greatest joys in life. My local school district on their website says that love of learning is a core value of theirs. And homeschool co-ops and online schools say that love of learning is a core value of theirs. They even claim that they foster a love of learning. And you had the experience of working for one of these companies. So tell us about that, Sandy.
I did. I got the opportunity to work for a company for about 5 years in the education space. And their heart was really good and their intention really was to just foster this love of learning. And that stamp was love of learning was stamped all over their website. And I think one of the biggest problems they actually had was that their funding was tied to public schools. And so because of that, they had to check all of these boxes and they had to put all of these requirements in to their program. And that in and of itself is what killed the love of learning. Because I would think, yeah, love of learning, of course that's what we want and that's what we're doing here. But then I would look at how we were actually implementing things and I'd look around and I'd listen and there were instances where kids are naturally inclined to do that and to be that way and excited about a little aspect of learning. But when I really looked at it, I thought, I don't think we did anything to foster that. That's a story of that child, but I don't think it's anything that we were doing or anything that we implemented in order to help foster that love of learning. And what I saw was the things that we were implementing from a lot of requirements was actually doing the opposite of what the core heart of that company was, to develop this love of learning. And so we talk a lot, Angela, about less is more. And I think that was the case here because these kids and these students were required to check some of these boxes. It left less time for them to be able to be bored and to find something and to engage in an interest that they had.
So you have touched on one of our 4 C's that kills curiosity. And I want to get into that, but first, I want listeners to understand this key principle to fostering love of learning. And that is that you cannot fall in love with information or facts disconnected from context. And not just any context, but what people really connect with and fall in love with is other people or themselves. I guess we could
Stories.
include, you can include yourself as a person, and nature. And that is through stories and being in nature. And purposeful work. Those 3 things that we talked about are really your curriculum. People say, well, what do I do if I ditch the textbooks? I'm just always looking for organic, spontaneous teaching moments. I'm just always watching for those. And you do get good at watching for those spontaneous teaching moments. But I think it helps to shift our focus going from curriculum and textbooks to just great stories, spending time in nature, and purposeful work or projects. So summarize, now you've talked about this in past episodes, Sandy, but just to tie it into this principle, briefly share your daughter's passion for World War II and how that connects to this key principle that people fall in love with people and nature.
Yeah. So my oldest, I don't even know where she got this. I'm going to call it an obsession, this obsession with World War II. And really, it came out of the humanity. She's very connected to human and humanity and knowing the atrocities of World War II and trying to understand it. We had joked about is the fact that when she was 12, she actually asked for Mein Kampf for Christmas. What she wanted, she explained, she said, I wanted to understand why people would follow somebody. So she was connecting to these humans and trying to understand both sides of this. When you look at it from the real people and the stories, we learn more about ourselves and about humanity than if we just were to look at the facts.
I love that.
Yeah.
So it all connects back to people.
It really does. I had mentioned when we were talking a couple episodes ago about my daughter's interest in ants and how I was excited to see where that would go. Real life recent examples. We found an ant company in Arizona, which I thought would be good to have a company that was in Arizona because there's species that you don't want to cross state lines. And so I emailed them and I just said, we would like to talk to a real person to be able to learn more about how to start this hobby and to learn all the habits of ants. So my daughter was really excited. lady emailed back and gave us her phone number. So Millie sat down and she wrote all the questions that she had about ants, and she called, and the woman that answered was definitely a scientist. So she didn't have this like super excited demeanor about her. She was very scientific. And so as Millie would ask a question, she would answer it. And by the end of the call, Millie hung up and said, "I want nothing to do with ants," because they're just creepy, they're crawly, and I don't want anything to do with them. And, okay, on we go. Back to space. Astronomy is her core obsession. So
that also illustrates how just sharing facts in a disinterested way, especially, killed her curiosity in ants. Do you think it could have gone differently if she had presented the information differently?
I might still. So I've been thinking about buying. We were talking elaborate, we were talking about this, these systems and these ecosystems, which I thought would be super cool. But really, we also talk about that principle of keeping it simple. And I think all she wanted to see was an ant tunnel. She wanted to see an ant dig a tunnel. What does that look like? Yeah, just looking for those opportunities. I saw an opportunity and I took it, but that doesn't necessarily mean that's going to be her lifelong obsession. And that's another thing I found with kids is they're just these little sponges. And so they're curious about this, and then they're curious about this. And what I sometimes have done mistakenly is I think in my mind, okay, I'm going to create a whole experience about that. So I do my deep dive. By the time I come back and present all of the cool things that I have for them, they don't even care anymore. They're no longer interested. So if you can just keep it simple and do something about it right then, maybe ask a few questions or ask like, what are your questions? And allow them to start, help foster that thinking a little bit and see where they actually want to go and be open and listening instead of creating your own plan for them.
And what I've noticed is that the more time and effort and work, and especially money, that I put in outside of our learning time together, actually that reduces the quality of their learning experience. If it's really something that they can't do without a lot of help from you, then it's probably not something that they're ready for. I'm hypothesizing that just based on tons of experience and tons of reading. Like the building the treehouse. Actually, we did that in my micro school. They were so excited about it in the beginning, and it fizzled out. They had fun for a while, like, oh, we get to screw in some screws and hammer, but it turned out most of the work to build a viable treehouse that would be structurally sound and they could play in was beyond their ability level. And so if the adult is doing most of the work, then the child's not getting very much out of it. Now, if it's something that the adult wants to do anyway, I think that's different. Like if I'm doing my own project and I want to build a treehouse in the backyard, I think that that's fun. And I'm not just trying to do this for them, then I think that's different. Then they'll get a lot out of watching you go through the process and helping pound in a few nails and line up the boards. And I mean, these kids in my micro school, their favorite part of that process was just cutting down all the trees and leveling it and digging the holes needed. I think most adults would think of that as the grunt work, the boring part. They enjoyed it. Guess what? Because that's on their level. Like that's what they are ready for. That's what they're capable of. And so one of these days I was actually writing about this for our digest. I write up a digest to email to the parents after each day at the micro school. So I'm sitting here at my desk looking out my window, and as I'm writing about the treehouse, I see this, they call it a worm cemetery and a worm hospital that they built out of scraps of wood from the treehouse. Very rudimentary building of this hospital. They drew a cross on top of one of the scraps of wood in marker and wrote Worm Hospital on the top. And then they had little gravestone markers for the dead worms. I mean, they were actually finding dead worms in the ground or live worms, and they would put the live worms in the worm hospital and the dead worms they would bury and put these tombstones.
They're sorting. Look at that math. They're sorting too. Just kidding.
Yeah. And I thought if I put the Treehouse Project on my website, that would sell. Parents would be like, that's amazing. The kids are helping to build a treehouse with a real carpenter. My dad was leading the project. But if I put the worm cemetery up and the worm hospital, that wouldn't sell. People would think of it as not educational. And yet I think that's exactly what they needed. That's
That was the
exactly what
true
those kids needed at that moment, was they needed to be just playing around with these blocks, these chunks of scrap wood, just building. And that's something that was at their level that they could do.
And so they were doing the work. You know, we talked about them doing the work when you were talking about Lydia learning that Russian word and how it was really fun when you were doing the work. It was fun for you, but not fun for her. And so the same thing, like the treehouse is really fun for those who are actually doing the hard work of building it and figuring that out, but it wasn't fun for the kids. So they had fun when it was their project that they were building, their worm community. We have a mutual friend who is an incredible singer. And something that stuck with me that she said one time was that when she was a little girl, her grandmother said, it's such a shame that she loves to sing so much because she's so bad at it.
And she's a beautiful singer now.
And she's an absolutely incredible, beautiful singer. But because it was something that she cared about and she loved, and her parents didn't pay for her lessons. She actually did the hard work of earning the money and paying for her own lessons. And now is an incredible, beautiful singer because she she created that for herself. She found something she was interested in and she cared enough to seek out the voice lessons and to pay for the voice lessons. And how many times I don't know how many parents have forced their kids through piano because they think it's important, but how many of those have actually resulted in a child who absolutely loves the piano? When I really think about how can we actually foster that love of learning, what does it look like in real life examples? And I can see ways in which I've killed it and ways in which I've kind of left it alone so it developed it itself in my kids.
Do you know how many times I've been so disappointed when I think that my kid's obsessed with something and it's going to develop into this amazing talent? And then they just drop it after a month or two.
Yep.
That's happened a lot. Not with the card throwing. I was like, yeah, we'll let that one wear itself out.
Sometimes they never do.
When finally he was able to consistently slice through a stalk of celery, then he was good. And I was like, whew, okay, moving on. I know parents kind of freak out sometimes when their kids like, I want to be a bus driver when I grow up. That sounds like the funnest job in the world. Why do we panic? Do we really think that they're actually still going to want to be a bus driver when they're 18, No, of course they won't. That was my third child's desire when he was 7 or 8. And then he wanted to be a police officer, but that was actually, he says, Mom, I still want to be a police officer, but I'm not going to be because I'm not going to make as much money as I would like to. But yeah, I mean, they know it'll wear out. Their desires change. We just need to trust them, trust the process. But if from the time they're little, we're constantly putting down their interests, what they want to pursue,
and replace it with our own,
then they never get to have that experience of feeding their interests, that spark of an interest to see if it develops into a passion, just becoming a passionate person. So we're talking about this key principle that you can't fall in love with information and facts disconnected from context, and that people primarily fall in love with people, or not fall in love with, but people connect with and are engaged with stories of other people, and they connect with nature. People in real life or stories about other people, those are the things that they connect with and fall in love with. So, of course, that begs the question, what about math? Math doesn't connect to people or nature. And I would argue that a love for mathematics is a love for nature, because math is the pattern and relationships between everything in the universe. Math is in nature. Math connects with nature, but also math connects with people. In a lot of the stories we've talked about, the story of Dr. Semmelweis, who worked at Vienna General Hospital in the maternity ward. All these women were dying in the hospital right after they gave birth to their babies. Why is that happening? Most doctors thought it's just the way it is. Just a certain number of women die after childbirth. So he was going back through the records and graphing these statistics of how many women died every year in the hospital. And he discovered that twice as many women were dying in the first clinic. The women were cared for by doctors in the first clinic, and they were cared for by midwives in the second clinic, and they had half the death rate. So why would that be? Doctors wanted to dismiss it. Oh, it has nothing to do. No, it's the women. It's they're wearing too tight of clothing. They're not getting enough exercise. Like, this is what makes them prone to dying after childbirth. And so what they would do is after the women would die, the doctors would dissect their bodies in the next room to try to find the cause of their death. And then after they had their hands in this cadaver, they would wipe their hands on their aprons, which were already dried with blood, and then they would walk in and deliver another baby. So, how do you think what was causing their deaths? As they're trying to figure out, by dissecting these bodies, they're trying to figure out what's causing the death. That's actually causing these women to die. They are spreading this diseased, they called it childbed fever, but it was actually sepsis of the blood. And then they would get this bad bacteria on their hands, and then they would poison the blood of these women whose babies they were delivering. So he tracked statistics. So there are these tables with statistics of death rates. So math was very strongly tied to people, and we were emotionally connected to the stories of these women who were dying after childbirth at the hands of these doctors unwittingly. Just a lack of knowledge of germs, of course. I'm not vilifying them, but those statistics mattered to us, and understanding those statistics and percentages and graphs, being able to read graphs, that was all tied to people. Any thoughts before we move on to the 4C?
No, let's move on to the 4Cs.
Okay. So, Sandy, you've talked about how the teacher needs to be passionate about what they're teaching.
Right.
And I've heard a lot of people say that, well, if you can get a good teacher who's passionate about what they're teaching, then that is what really inspires students to love that subject matter. And that's certainly a truth.
It can spark
That
it.
is one truth. It can totally spark it. But I would say most teachers and homeschool parents who abide by that are often breaking one or more of these 4 C's that kill curiosity. Cutting the cocoon. I have this very vivid memory in my mind of you raising monarch butterflies and watching one of these monarch butterflies hatch out of its cocoon with both of our kids were there. Just explain the process briefly, and I think you know where I'm going with this. What effect would that have if you cut the cocoon for the monarch? Okay, take it away, Sandy.
I believe what happened that day is I knew that these were going to hatch, and we were doing a service project at a church. And so I brought along my little sticks with my cocoons hanging from them, and the kids were, watching and waiting, and they'd sit there and they'd stare at it for a while, and then they'd go and do their thing until all of a sudden you'd see this little crack appear. And then you knew the magic was about to happen. Yeah, it's so tempting to want to, touch it and peel things back. But as soon as you touch it, you're going to destroy it. That butterfly will not live if you touch it. And I wish I had a story to tell you about that I actually did, but I would not. I wouldn't let anybody, touch them while they were emerging and coming out.
What if you helped it out of the cocoon while it was struggling? Like the importance of its straining to break that open.
So then once the caterpillar it's unfurling its wings, like it's breaking its own, like it's created this form, and then it's coming out, and as it comes out of the cocoon, it doesn't even immediately fly away. It pulls it out, and its wings are just limp, and they just hang there. And it's so tempting to think that something is actually wrong with it when this is actually just the process. And if you can't interfere at all, like if you interfere when it's trying to, when it's too early, when it's green, if you interfere when you see that first crack and you try to like help things along, the next process where it hangs there with these limp wings, if you try to, stretch them out or touch them in any way. But it's so important that we sit and we watch and we wait and we observe those butterflies, and we don't touch them and we don't help them, because if we do, we will actually kill them.
Yeah. So this idea of, I love how you talked about the timing, but also, and mainly the interfering with an organic process. And even when we try to help it along, which is what most of us try to do, right? We're helping too much. If we were to help it by just like, let's just cut that cocoon open for it a little bit, it would die because it needs to go through that struggle to survive. And when I liken that to learning, it's not just they're not going to survive, they're not going to be able to support themselves. I'm referring to the love of learning, that kills the love of learning. So we've talked about cutting the cocoon. That's what we'll call it. When you try to help give too much away, you don't let them struggle through figuring it out themselves. You talked about covering too much kills curiosity. That was what your online school that you worked for that had love of learning as their motto all over everything was killing curiosity. One of the reasons is because they were covering too much. They were trying to, well, they had to
You
really
had to
check
know
all the
all of these things.
boxes. Yeah, in order to meet the public school requirements, because they were connected to public funding. But another thing that they were doing that kills curiosity that also starts with the letter C is they were compartmentalizing information into subjects. They were still, we can't seem to escape it. Like it's
so hard not to. Like I find myself struggling with it.
Because, well, for one thing, we were raised from the time we were 5 to think in this compartmentalized way.
Right.
Nobody thinks that way organically. But when you train a child from a very young age to think in terms of this, we will label as science. This we will label as math. This we will label as language arts. And this we will label as history or whatever the topics are. And then you're disconnecting all that information from real life. Then that's the whole idea is when we present things in terms of subjects, I would say that's the principle that's violated most egregiously is people can't seem to get away from teaching according to subject. And the only reason I will point out, do you see these threads of science in this story or project that your child's doing? Do you see the threads of math? Do you see the threads of language arts? Is simply to help people have peace of mind because that's how they're already thinking. It's been so ingrained in them. It's really shaped our view of the world. To tie it back to this key principle of people are interested in learning about people and nature. And when we teach according to subject, you're taking it out of context and you are disconnecting it from people and nature, all this information you're teaching. And the other one is correcting kills curiosity. And maybe we'll dive into that more in another episode. I'm not really feeling that right now. I quoted Maria Montessori in the last episode, her ideas about how we become, when we always have a teacher or authority figure correcting a learner, that they learn to not look for their own mistakes. They learn to become dependent on some outside authority figure to tell them what they're doing wrong because it's not their job. We've taught them it's not their job to look for mistakes, or we don't even have to call them mistakes. They're not always mistakes, but ways that they can improve. And my editor for my book does a really good job of that. Instead of saying, let me correct what you wrote here, here's what you should do instead, she will teach me the principle and ask me a good question and say, I want you to write more of this. Here's the principle for making your writing more interesting. Now go through this and see if you can make changes on your own to improve your writing. And so teaching our kids how to recognize, if we want to use writing as an example, and would you quickly share what you learned about how most great writers become great writers?
Oh, yeah. So I think this was a concept I actually learned a little bit through Charlotte Mason. And then I kept seeing this recurring theme of some of these great authors that we know and we love. They actually got good at what they do because they self-studied other authors. So they found an author that they identified that they just loved, and so they dissected their writing. So they would read it and they would read it, and then without exactly copying it, they would put it away, and then they would try to write in that same style and recreate how the other author was writing using their own voice.
Right. So they are extrapolating from, and when you read many authors and not just one great book, but many great books, you start making connections between them and you see, I see that they all have these elements in common. Best book on writing I've ever read, and actually the only book on writing I've ever read, is called Nobody Wants to Read Your SHIT by Stephen Pressfield. And he very entertainingly and concisely points out all these elements of great writing. He says you need to abide by these principles, whether it's fiction or nonfiction, book or screenplay. These are principles of great writing and great storytelling. And then you just read lots of great writing, a variety of styles, variety of authors, and then you write. You just write and write and write and write and write.
Yep.
So I've had a lot of homeschoolers ask me, what's a good writing curriculum? And I say, that's your writing curriculum. Read tons of great books, great writing, or if you're studying essay writing, read a lot of great magazine articles. And then just let your kids write. Write in a journal, write fiction, write an essay, whatever is most interesting to them, just let them write. And you will get better at writing that way. Alex Haley, author of Roots, who I have said is my favorite, or which I have said is my favorite book of all time. He dropped out of college his sophomore year, I think it was. You can fact check me on that. But it was pretty early in his college career. He never majored in writing, so he dropped out and went to work on a ship during World War II, doing some low-level work. And then he just started writing for pleasure. And he wrote and wrote and wrote and wrote and ended up coming up with this absolute masterpiece, work of literary genius, won the Pulitzer Prize for it.
Wow.
Just one example. We could name dozens more. Virginia Woolf, totally unschooled, and ended up an incredible writer.
Fitzgerald. I believe it's the same story with Fitzgerald. Might need to
Really?
fact check that. I've been reading The Little House on the Prairie to my daughter since she was 5. One of the things I think is really fascinating is she writes so beautifully. Like you can see all these processes, the way that they lived, and you can really see it because she practiced the skill of painting pictures with words because her sister became blind. And so because her sister was blind, she would want her sister to see with her ears. And so she would practice this art of describing everything to her sister. And then that helped her develop this talent of writing. And so
I remember that. I thought the same thing. These experiences we have in life that we don't realize, we have no idea how it's going to help us in the future. She had no idea at that point in her life she'd end up writing a book series about her life experiences. And yet she was getting this practice describing the world around her because her sister was blind. An example of how you can create a class around a subject and still abide by these principles.
I love that.
That will help your kids or your students fall in love with learning. A class that my daughter took when she was 14 at a local homeschool co-op. This was right before she started public school. And the class was called The Psychology of Harry Potter. And they analyzed the different characters in Harry Potter through the lens of psychological terms and studies. And so in that way, you're tying it to people and a story, even though they're fictional people. Have you had experiences with classes or even classes on Wonderwell Learning?
So one of the teachers I have on Wonderwell Learning, she's a sign language teacher. And one of the things I love that she does is instead of just teaching, basic signs and grammar and the order of the words, she actually teaches sign language through stories. So she typically ties it to a Bible story. So they're connecting this story that they already know, and they're learning this language through the story itself. It reminds me of how Lydia was learning Russian through a story. She does it, the story of Peter walking on water. And so they learn the sign language through the story and these people. So you connect to the people, you connect to the story, you're connecting to God. And at the same time, learning the signs to it that connect so much better than if you're just learning individual signs. Again, just like we always talk about that part to whole, a whole to part.
Into Google Translate than each individual word.
And they're also learning like a whole new culture. So the deaf community has its own culture. And so just like there are classes and there are ways that love of learning is fostered in as a whole. And that could be really, you just have to think outside the box.
We have to think upside down. You just switch it. Instead of starting with the subject, think of what stories, like I do with my landmark Supreme Court cases. We start with the stories of landmark Supreme Court cases, and then we pull from that the politics, the amendments of the Constitution. What's really powerful and gets kids like really on fire about what they're learning about, takes it to the next level, is when they start making connections across stories. So you're learning all these individual stories, and you're learning about World War II through stories of different individuals. But when you start learning about other stories from other times and places in the world, or fictional stories that were written in other times and places in the world, it's so exciting for kids to start making connections between seemingly disconnected events and people and places. For example, in my micro school, we have made connections between the Anne Boleyn trial in 1536, Miranda versus Arizona, the landmark Supreme Court case in 1966, and the founding fathers of the U.S. Constitution in 1776. I just realized those all end in 6. That didn't even occur to me until just now. It feels exciting and expansive when you can see the common threads between all these events.
Sometimes people say, well, I don't know how to do this. I don't know how to foster a love of learning. If you don't know what to do, then I would say pick up a book. Just pick up a book and read aloud. There are a lot of really great book lists out there. And so there is so much. Your child will naturally start asking questions when you start reading a story. And then you can take those opportunities to dig deep. So it's really important to just take some of the information, really look at, are you creating that love of learning environment within your home? Think about some of the curiosity killers that we've talked about: subjects, spoon feeding, rushing through stuff too quickly.
Correction.
Thank you. Which one of those are showing up? And how can you just shift? I find it's so important to not make these dramatic changes, but think about this small shift that you can make in what you're doing now. And what's one story that you could possibly bring into your homeschool this week that would spark deep your curiosity? Pay attention to your child. Watch for that spark when they light up. What kind of things can you position to help foster that? Or maybe what can you not do to not kill that, and that could be just giving them that time or that space.
Mm-hmm. So you can't just have love of learning as your slogan or one of your core values. You really need to be implementing these principles of learning and great mentorship in order to help your children actually fall in love with learning.
And when you see that love of learning stamped on a program or on a class somewhere, ask them, how do you foster the love of learning, and what does the love of learning mean in your program? So that you can really make an educated decision now that you know what love of learning is.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. It was so fun to talk. Every time we talk, it inspires me even more. Like I've been trying to implement these principles, and every time we talk, I realize I can do a better job. Thank you, making me a better mom.
Yes, me too. I'm still learning. I'm still making changes.
Yeah.
So thank you. Thanks for
it.
talking with me.
Thank you.
Okay,
bye.
See ya.
If this podcast was helpful for you, please leave us a review and share with a friend.
Until next time, start with stories and everything else will follow.
You can learn more about our other education projects at angelselda.com and wonderwelllearning.com.